Life in the medieval period was a gamble, and the gamble was always on the weather. For the vast majority of people, probably 9 out of every 10, life was tied to the soil. You were a peasant, you worked the land, your survival, your family's survival depended entirely on the harvest. There was no supermarket, no global supply chain, no government surplus to bail you out. There was only what you could grow. The entire rhythm of the year was built around this. Planting in the spring, tending the fields in the summer, and the frantic, hopeful work of the harvest in the fall. A good harvest meant you would eat through the winter. It meant you had seed for the next year. It meant life. A bad harvest meant hunger. A series of bad harvests meant something much worse. It meant famine. And the system was fragile. It was a tightrope walk with no net. Most peasants farmed using a 3-field system. They'd plant one field with a winter crop like wheat, a second with a spring crop like oats or beans, and let the third lie fallow to recover its nutrients. This was clever for its time. It was better than exhausting the soil completely. But it was not enough to build a real surplus. Most harvests produced just enough to get by, to pay the Lord his due, and to save seed for the next planting, as there was very little cushion. So when things went wrong, they went wrong in a big way. And in the early 14th century, things started to go very wrong. The climate began to change. Historians now call it the Little Ice Age. The average temperatures dropped, the growing seasons got shorter, and worse, the weather became unpredictable and violent. The problem wasn't just cold. Years after year after year, the skies would open up and refuse to close. The Great Famine, which struck Europe from 1315 to 1317, was born from this endless, miserable rain. In the spring of 1315, it started to rain and it didn't stop. The fields turned to mud. The seeds rotted in the ground before they could sprout. The crops that did grow were stunted and diseased. The harvest was a disaster. Across England, France, the Low Countries, and Germany, the story was the same. The granaries were nearly empty. People hoped for a better year in 1316. They planted what little seed they had left. But the weather was just as bad, if not worse. The rain came again, cold and relentless. This time there was no reserve. The meager supplies from the year before were gone. The price of grain, the staple food for everyone, skyrocketed. It became 8 times more expensive than normal. A person who earned a day's wage might only be able to afford a single loaf of bread. The problem was compounded by the lack of infrastructure. There was no way to move food efficiently. A region 50 miles away might have a slightly better harvest, but the roads were terrible, little more than muddy tracks. Transporting bulky goods like grain was slow, expensive, and dangerous. Bandits were a constant threat. So each village, each region, was an isolated island, and when the harvest failed on that island, there was no rescue coming. This war made everything worse. Kings and lords still fought their battles. Armies marched across the countryside, and armies needed to eat. They would take what little food they could find from the peasants. They trampled fields, burned villages, and stole livestock. A scorched earth policy was a common military tactic. It was an effective way to hurt your enemy, but it guaranteed starvation for the people who lived on that land. So, the stage was set. A fragile agricultural system, a changing climate, and the constant drain of warfare. It was a perfect storm. The ever-present threat of hunger, which always lurked in the background of medieval life, was about to step into the light and consume everything. The rains had failed, the harvest was lost, and now the true horror would begin. When the food runs out, the body begins to eat itself. This is not a metaphor, it is a biological fact. And for millions of people in medieval Europe, it became their reality. Famine was not a quick death. It was a slow, degrading process of disintegration, a public spectacle of human decay. It began with a simple, gnawing hunger, the kind that twists your stomach and makes it impossible to think about anything else. At first, people would cope. They would eat less. A family's single loaf of bread would be sliced thinner and thinner. The watery soup would have fewer vegetables, but this managed hunger soon gave way to desperation. The reserves were gone, the body's own reserves were next. The first thing to go is the fat. The body burns it for energy. People grew thin, then gaunt. Their faces became hollowed out, their eyes seeming to sink back into their skulls. Clothes that once fit snugly now hung on them like sacks, but the fat runs out quickly. Then the body turns to the muscles. This is the stage of wasting, what doctors call atrophy. The body literally consumes its own tissues to stay alive. Arms and legs become like sticks. The simple act of walking to the well becomes an exhausting effort. People grew weak, lethargic. They would spend most of their days sitting, trying to conserve every last calorie. The world would shrink to the size of their hut, then to the size of their bed. A starving person is a picture of contradictions. Their limbs are skeletal, but their bellies might be swollen and distended. This is a sign of severe protein deficiency, a condition called kwashiorkor. Fluid builds up in the abdomen, creating a grotesque parody of a well-fed gut. Their skin would change, becoming dry, flaky, and sometimes covered in sores that would not heal. Their hair would become brittle and fall out, but the most dangerous effect of starvation is invisible. It's the collapse of the immune system. A body fighting for its own survival has no resources left to fight off disease. And disease was everywhere in the medieval world. With a functioning immune system, a person might survive a bout of dysentery or a respiratory infection. For a starving person, a common cold could be a death sentence, so people didn't just die of starvation. They died of pneumonia, of influenza, of tuberculosis, of dysentery. Famine and pestilence were known as the two grim sisters, and they always walked hand in hand. The villages of the starving were silent, sick places. The air was filled with the sounds of coughing and moaning, and the stench of sickness and death. And then there were the diseases born directly from desperation. People were forced to eat things that were not meant for human consumption. This included diseased animals, but also spoiled or contaminated grain. In the cold, wet years of the Great Famine, a fungus called ergot thrived on rye crops. When people milled this contaminated rye into flour and baked it into bread, they were poisoning themselves. The resulting sickness was called ergotism, or more commonly, St. Anthony's fire. It was a horrifying affliction. One form caused convulsions, muscle spasms, and terrifying hallucinations. Sufferers were said to writhe and twitch, as if possessed by demons. The other form was gangrenous. The poison constricted blood vessels, cutting off circulation to the extremities. A person's fingers, toes, hands, and feet would feel as if they were on fire. Then they would turn numb, blacken, and fall off like a dry twig from a tree. Imagine a village where half the population is skeletal and weak, and the other half is either writhing in agony or watching their own limbs rot away. This was the physical reality of famine. It wasn't just an absence of food. It was an active, aggressive assault on the human body, turning people into walking ghosts long before they finally died. Famine does not just destroy the body. It destroys the soul. It corrodes the bonds that hold a society together, dissolving trust, charity, and even love, until all that is left is the raw animal instinct to survive. In medieval Europe, the social fabric was woven from threads of obligation, family to family, peasant to lord, and Christian to Christian. Famine ripped that fabric to shreds. The first thread to snap was often the family. Under normal circumstances, the family was the core unit of survival, but famine inverted this logic. A family was no longer a source of strength. It was a collection of mouths to feed. And when there wasn't enough food, the most heartbreaking choices were made. Chroniclers of the time wrote of parents who abandoned their children. They would lead them deep into the woods and leave them there, or simply turn them out of the house to fend for themselves. These were not monsters. They were parents who had reached a point of impossible desperation, believing that at least some of the family might survive if the weakest were sacrificed. The old and the sick were often the first to be neglected. They were seen as useless mouths, unable to contribute to the search for food. They would be left in their beds to waste away. Stories of husbands abandoning wives, or the strong leaving the weak, became commonplace. The fundamental duty to care for one's own blood dissolved in the acid of hunger. As families broke down, so did communities. The medieval village was a close-knit place. People knew each other. They helped each other during tough times. Charity was a central Christian virtue. The church and the local monastery were supposed to be a safety net, distributing grain from their stores to the needy. But famine overwhelmed these systems completely. A village might have 100 starving families. The parish priest had nothing to give. The monasteries, after emptying their own granaries, were forced to bar their gates. They were besieged by desperate crowds, and the monks themselves were beginning to starve. The very institutions that were supposed to embody Christian charity had to turn their backs on the suffering, or be consumed by it. Trust evaporated. Your neighbor was no longer someone you could rely on, they were a competitor. They were a potential thief. Anyone who had a tiny scrap of food, a hidden bag of grain, a spawning chicken lived in constant fear. The doors were barricaded at night. A person seen foraging in the woods would be watched with suspicion. Did they find something, an edible root, a dead animal? That suspicion could easily turn to violence. Crime skyrocketed. People who had been law-abiding farmers their whole lives became thieves. They stole food, livestock, tools, anything that could be traded for a crust of bread. Gangs of starving, desperate men, known as vagrants, roamed the countryside. They were a terror to anyone who crossed their path. They would attack travelers, raid isolated farmhouses, and fight over a dead dog in the road. The normal order of society collapsed. The lord of the manor and his reeve were powerless to stop it. They had their own problems. The feudal contract, the very basis of medieval society, was broken. Peasants owed their lord labor and loyalty. In return, the lord was supposed to offer protection and justice. But what protection could a lord offer against the weather? What justice could he provide when his own people were stealing from each other to survive? Many lords simply hoarded what food they had for their own households, barricading themselves in their stone manors while the villagers outside starved. This bred a deep and lasting resentment. The people saw that their supposed protectors were either unable or unwilling to help them. The social hierarchy seemed like a cruel joke. The world became a grim, atomized place. There was no family, no community, no law, no charity. There was only your own hunger and the hunger of everyone around you. Your neighbor was not your friend. Your neighbor was your enemy. They were one more person competing for the last edible thing in a world that had nothing left. When desperation reaches its peak, humanity recedes. The rules that govern civilized life become meaningless. There is only one rule left: eat. In the darkest depths of a medieval famine, people were driven to acts that still shock us centuries later. They ate things that defy imagination, things that stripped away their last vestiges of dignity and broke the ultimate taboo. The descent began with what was merely disgusting or pitiful. People ate the leaves from trees, grass from the fields, and the bark from trees. They dug for roots, even poisonous ones, hoping to boil the toxins out. They ate acorns, which had to be leached for days to be made edible. These things offered little nutrition and often caused severe digestive problems, but they filled an empty stomach for a little while. They ate their seed grain. This was a suicidal act in the long term, as it meant there would be nothing to plant for the next year's harvest. It was a choice to live for one more week at the cost of the future, but when you are starving, the future is an unimaginable luxury. Only the next meal matters. They ate their animals, first the oxen, which were essential for plowing the fields. Another sacrifice of the future for the present. Then they ate the horses, the cats, the dogs, and the rats. And they hunted for vermin in the walls of their own homes. Leather became a food source. People would boil their shoes, their belts, their harnesses, trying to soften the tough material into a swallowable, gelatinous mess. And when all of that was gone, a final, terrible line was crossed. The chronicles from the Great Famine are unflinching in their descriptions. Johannes de Troclo, an English monk, wrote that the poor ate their own children, and dogs and mice, and the dung of doves. The mention of children is not an exaggeration for effect. It was a reported reality. Stories of cannibalism spread across the land. It was the ultimate mark of societal collapse. These were not savage tribes. These were Christian farmers, driven to the absolute limit of human endurance. Travelers were warned not to journey alone, as they might be ambushed and killed not for their money, but for their flesh. In some towns, there were rumors of strange new meats appearing in the market. Prisons became charnel houses. When new prisoners were thrown into the dungeons, they were often set upon by the starving inmates already there, who would tear them apart and eat them raw. The horror of this is almost impossible to comprehend. It represents a complete inversion of human nature. But perhaps the most common form of cannibalism was not predatory but scavenger. People began to dig up the bodies of the recently dead. Graveyards were desecrated at night. A family would bury a loved one only to find the grave empty the next morning. The dead were no longer sacred. They were just meat. The sheer scale of death was overwhelming. People died in their homes, in the streets, in the fields. There were not enough living and healthy people left to bury the dead. Bodies were left to rot where they fell. In some towns, huge pits were dug, and the dead were thrown in without ceremony, without even a priest's blessing. The smell of death hung over every village and town. It was the smell of decay, of disease, and of a world that had come undone. Living through this was a psychological trauma beyond measure. To see your neighbors, your friends, even your family reduced to skeletal figures fighting over scraps. To be so hungry that you would consider eating things that would make you vomit in normal times. To witness the unthinkable act of one human eating another. This was the gruesome reality for the survivors. They had seen the absolute bottom of human existence, and it was a sight that would haunt them and their descendants for generations. A famine is like a great fire. When it finally burns itself out, the landscape is forever changed. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 and the other, smaller famines that followed left deep and permanent scars on medieval Europe. The world that emerged was not the same one that had entered the years of hunger. The impact was felt in the population, in the economy, and in the minds of the people. The most immediate impact was demographic. The death toll was staggering. While precise figures are impossible to know, historians estimate that in many parts of Northern Europe, between 10% and 25% of the population perished. Entire villages were wiped out, their fields left to be reclaimed by weeds and forest. And major towns saw their populations shrink dramatically. This was a demographic catastrophe on a scale not seen for centuries. It took generations for the population to recover to its pre-famine levels. The economic consequences were just as severe. The foundations of the agricultural economy were shattered. The death of so many plow animals, like oxen, made it incredibly difficult to get the fields back into production. The desperate act of eating seed grain meant there was a shortage of seeds for planting. The price of food remained high for years, while the price of other goods collapsed because no one had money to buy them. Landowners and lords saw their incomes plummet as their tenants died and their fields lay fallow. The intricate web of credit and debt that held the rural economy together fell apart. It was a long, slow, and painful recovery, but the deepest scars were social and psychological. And famine had shaken the very pillars of the medieval world. The people had looked to their leaders for help, and their leaders had failed them. The nobles, who were meant to be their protectors, had either proven powerless against nature or had callously hoarded food for themselves. The feudal bond of loyalty and obligation was severely weakened. A quiet resentment began to fester among the peasantry, a sense that the social order was not just, that it had failed them in their hour of greatest need. The church's authority was also damaged. People had prayed for deliverance. They had held fasts and religious processions, begging God to stop the rains and end their suffering. But the rains continued, and the suffering grew worse. For many, it felt as though God had abandoned them, or was punishing them with a terrible and incomprehensible wrath. Their faith was not necessarily destroyed, but it was tested and changed. It became darker, more focused on sin, death, and damnation. The power of the local priest, who could offer no real comfort or aid, was diminished. The experience of the famine created a deep-seated fear that haunted European culture for centuries. The Great Hunger became a part of folk memory, a horror story told to children. It reinforced a grim and pessimistic view of the world, a world where disaster could strike at any moment without warning and without mercy. The art and literature of the later Middle Ages are filled with a fascination with death, decay, and the fragility of life, an obsession no doubt fed by the living memory of mass starvation. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the great famines of the early 14th century was how they set the stage for an even greater catastrophe. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, it struck a population that was already weakened and vulnerable. Generations of malnutrition had left people with compromised immune systems. The social and economic structures were still fragile from the years of hunger. The psychological resilience of the people was low. The famines had been a brutal body blow to Christendom. The plague would be the knockout punch. The world had been weakened, and now it was ready to break.